It's finally here! Paradox has officially brought East Asia to Crusader Kings 3 with the new All Under Heaven DLC. And believe it or not, it's actually good. This expansion isn't just a map extension, but instead it's packed with new mechanics, way too much to cover in one video, which is why today we're going to focus solely on Japan. So in this video, let's have a deep dive into 11th century Japan and its depiction in CK3. We'll explore the relationship, or lack thereof, between the Emperor and his regent, the new Rizō and Soryo government system, and we'll see how well they are founded in historical research. We'll also cover a few dynasties and characters in the 1066 start, more specifically the ones involved in the starting scenario, a Never-Waning Moon, and see what historians have been saying about these, and how thorough Paradox was with their research on this region. If you haven't already, consider liking and subscribing, and tell us in the comments if there are any other historical strategy games you'd like to see covered. And be sure to let us know what you think of All Under Heaven, and if you'd like to see us cover another region of Asia. Oh, and by the way, pronunciation will be a bit iffy for this one, so please bear with me. Thanks, and enjoy the video. There are 3 new game mechanics introduced in Japan that represent how Japanese governance took place in what we Europeans call the medieval age. The role of the emperor, the Rizō and Soryo government types, and the importance of house blocks. The first major difference from the traditional CK3 experience is the role of the emperor, or Tenno, and his regent. Throughout much of Japanese history, the emperor has been merely a ceremonial figure who doesn't actually wield any real power. The emperor's regent, or as this position was actually called, Kampaku, on the other hand, who is essentially representing the government, holds the actual keys to the kingdom. Think of it like how, in the UK, King Charles and his court is merely ceremonial, whilst true power lies with Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government. Or, if you're watching this in a couple of years, how in the UK, Prime Minister Nigel Farage and his government is merely ceremonial, whilst true power lies with King Trump and his court. We'll touch more on this later when we talk about the current Emperor Yamato Chikahito in 1066, and his all-powerful but aging regent, Fujiwara. The next difference is the 2 new government types, the Rizō and the Soryo. The Rizō is basically the old imperial order. It is the court politics of classical Japan, or the Heian period, where power sits in Kyoto, and it's all about ceremony, rank, and paperwork. Here it's not about how much land you own, but how influential you are in government. And under the Rizō system, one of the most important currencies is influence, helping you to influence various aspects of politics. It works in a similar way as it does in the Byzantine Empire, but a big difference is that Rizō vassals can't actually declare war on each other. Historically, the Rizō system was Japan's attempt at a centralized bureaucratic state. All land was defined as allegedly public property, and thus essentially belonged to the emperor, and governors were appointed by the court in Kyoto to administer provinces and collect taxes for the central government on a temporary basis. The system was first put into place with the Taika reforms in 645, in an attempt to replicate Imperial China's rigorously efficient political system from the Tang dynasty. In the second half of the 7th century, it was specified first in the Kokugonri and then in the Gori administrative systems how the Rizō code should be applied to the country's administration by dividing up the country into the following provinces: districts, or as they are called in Japanese, gon, townships, and neighbourhoods, with the smallest of these categories, the neighbourhood, consisting of approximately 10 to 25 homes. At least this administrative categorization was really durable, as historian Cornelius Kiley points out. The last major change occurred in 823, when the province of Kaga, on the Sea of Japan north of the capital, was created from the 2 northernmost gun of Echizen province, which were then further split into 4. In the following year, the provincial level island of Tane, now called Tanegashima, was merged into the nearby province of Osumi in the southern Kyushu. No further alterations of provincial boundaries were made after that, and the total of 66 provinces and 2 islands persisted into the 19th century, albeit in an attenuated sense. So you see that Rizō system is really an attempt at efficient bureaucratic centralization, with a top-to-bottom approach of ordering the country and making it navigable and governable from one central location. The Soryo government type, on the other hand, is completely different, and in direct conflict with the Rizō system. It's much more similar to traditional feudalism. Local lords hold land in their own right, with their own levies and vassals, and compete for power against their peers through strength, diplomatic marriages, and intrigue. It is a direct challenge to the Rizō old order in that it aims to federalize and feudalize the hitherto centralized Japan, with hereditary landholding and titles basically representing the historical reality of the rising samurai clans and provincial lords. So understandably, in the eyes of the emperor and his regent, the Soryo system is actually illegal. That being said, in the 1066 start, we have a few vassals who have been granted Soryo status as a kind of reward for their loyalty, giving them more autonomy to govern. But if the power goes to their head, and they start to take other vassals' land, it gives the emperor's regent a casus belli on the Soryo to put them back in their place. To counteract this, a ruler can join a house block. A house block is the third major difference from European CK3, where Japanese noble families band together to create a sort of alliance. It is open to both Rizō and Soryo rulers, and it's kind of like an advanced alliance system. Everyone provides troops to protect each other, but you have to have decent cohesion, a measure of the block's unity, in order to function. The higher the cohesion, the more efficient the alliance. This mechanic is definitely historically founded. In fact, it is a smart way to model the real political conditions of the late Heian period, where formal titles meant less than your family's network of allies. We'll dive deeper into the main houses like the Fujiwara, Minamoto, or Taira in the next section. But in general, this situation in Crusader Kings is a really accurate depiction of Heian period Japan. As historian William McCullough sums up in his chapter in the Cambridge History of Japan, the Fujiwara Regency was in many aspects simply a prolonged and institutionalized phase in the cyclically shifting balance of power between the imperial line and the noble clans that had for shorter periods and in less formal ways been characteristic of Japanese government since at least the 7th century. It was distinguished from earlier phases of noble domination of the court by its long history, by its inheritance in a single family line, by the greater absoluteness of its domination, and by its coinciding with a period when changing economic and social conditions had much reduced the scope of the central government's authority, and made personal relationships and private purposes salient features of governmental operations. Its essential legitimacy, however, continued to be derived from the person of the emperor, and from the by then hallowed, if much truncated and changed, framework of the statutory regime. So while Fujiwara rule, like in the game, increasingly depended on their alliance network or house block, this was not a new situation. But still it shows that although they officially upheld the Rizō-style government system, they were in practice far more pragmatic, which was a sign of a shift in the traditional power system in 11th century Japan. The scenario, a Never-Waning Moon, is introduced with this text. Almost half a century has passed since Fujiwara Michinaga, Kampaku of Japan, penned his famous poem, "I think of this world as my world, and the full moon as never waning." Widely interpreted as a statement of the Fujiwara family's unassailable position as imperial regents, his words so far seem to ring true. Michinaga's son is set to pass his all-powerful position to the next generation. Will the Fujiwara maintain their dominance over the imperial court, against the protests of other aristocratic houses and the imperial family? This intro, and reference to a contemporary poem, makes it clear that the Fujiwara are the dominant force in Japan around this time. In fact, while it is hard to give an exact start date of their dominance, at the point of the 1066 start date, the imperial regency had been exclusively in their hands for over a century, and would continue to be so for another. And Michinaga, who the quoted poem is attributed to in the introduction text, was the father of Fujiwara Yorimichi, who is the reigning Kampaku in Crusader Kings 3. It therefore makes sense for us to start with this character, Regent Yorimichi, as our first character to research. His description is as follows. The ninth in a long line of Fujiwara regents, Yorimichi has ruled Japan for almost half a century. Succumbing to old age, he now stands poised to pass the baton to his son, Morozone, but uncertainty abounds. Emperor Chikahito chafes under the regency and is keen to re-center power around his chrysanthemum throne. Far from the capital, the distant provinces have broken from central bureaucracy, ruled by jumped-up aristocrats as their own fiefs. So Yorimichi has a lot on his plate. A fairly easy manipulable emperor who wants more power, greedy Soryos across the country, and the approach of his own mortality. You start the game 74 years young. It's fair enough Paradox names his difficulty level as hard. In-game, Yorimichi is of House Hokke, and is lustful, impatient, and arrogant. Altogether not a particularly nice guy. He has 3 wives, polygamy being the norm in this region, and 8 children, 6 of whom are still alive. Morozone, the son mentioned in the scenario who is likely to ascend to the throne, is actually the youngest of all his kids, and he's not by default your heir either. Instead, it's your 70-year-old brother, Norimichi, the succession being based upon one's influence in government, with seniority weighing heavily in a candidate's favour. According to historical records, Yorimichi genuinely had an extraordinarily long life, and ruled Japan as regent for much of it. As discussed already, he succeeded his father to the position of Sessho as early as 1017, and then became Kampaku in 1020, all the way until 1068. G. Cameron Hurst, professor for Japanese and Korean studies, sums up Yorimichi's relationship with the 1066 Emperor Chikahito, who in historical records is called by his imperial name Go-Reiji, and with his half-brother and heir, Go-Sanjo, as follows. In 1044, when Go-Suzaku became seriously ill and desired to abdicate in favour of Go-Reiji, Yorimichi faced a crisis. There was no Sekange heir as candidate for crown prince. It was customary to name a crown prince at the time of accession. Go-Suzaku wanted Go-Sanjo, then Prince Takahito, to be appointed because Go-Reiji had no male children. Having no alternative, and because the wishes of a dying emperor were not easily disregarded, Yorimichi grudgingly consented to this arrangement. Go-Sanjo was crown prince for an unprecedented 23 years, during which time he was the focus of Yorimichi's animosity. There may even have been an attempt upon his life. Yorimichi stalled Go-Reiji's abdication as long as possible, hoping for the birth of a Fujiwara prince. But when Go-Reiji died in 1068, he could not block the accession of the 33-year-old Go-Sanjo. Yorimichi's frustration is well mirrored in his response. He yielded the regency to his younger brother Norimichi and retired permanently to his villa at Uji. So Yorimichi was actually succeeded by his brother Norimichi for a few months in 1068, but then the post went on to Morozone, Yorimichi's son, who was regent more or less until the end of the century. However, Morozone was never able to hold the same degree of power as his father or grandfather, because by the time he was Kampaku, the emperors had found a clever way to circumvent the regent's control, the insei, or the practice of cloistered emperors, which basically meant an emperor would retire to a remote location to escape the regent's influence, and then from there be the real power behind the power, while their heirs would take on the ceremonial role of emperor. It was interesting for me learning about Morozone's breakdown of authority, because in the 2 playthroughs I tried preparing for this video, the same thing happened. Let us know in the comments if you've had this experience too. Now let's look at the emperor himself, Chikahito Tenno. His description is as follows. Chikahito grew up as a pawn in the tug-of-war played by his father, the retired emperor Go-Sanjo, and the Fujiwara regent Yorimichi. Now as emperor, Chikahito has done his best to assert imperial authority, but still largely performs a ceremonial role. Compelled by his consort's family to deny recognition of his only son, it is now Chikahito's brother, Takahito, who stands to inherit the chrysanthemum throne. So Chikahito, or Go-Reiji, as his official name as emperor was, has been a bit of a puppet his entire life, forced to watch on the sidelines. But what fascinated me most by this description is the so-called tug-of-war between the Emperor's heir Takehito and our main man Yorimichi. And this encapsulates the scenario and the main conflict of mid-11th century Japan so well. It was basically a power struggle between the Fujiwara clan, who were basically always the maternal uncles or grandfathers of emperors, and the immediate imperial family, of who right after the emperor himself, the most significant person was his half-brother and heir, Takehito. And, as half-brother, he was not related to the Fujiwara and thus less likely to be their puppet. Chikahito, as a polar opposite to Yorimichi, is a pretty nice guy, if not a bit of pushover, with the humble, content and chaste perks. He's got 4 wives, only has 1 son, of whom the description I just read mentioned how he's been denied inheritance. 7-year-old Tamayuki is labelled a bastard and cannot inherit the throne. Instead, the inheritance is going to Takehito, who we just described already. This whole situation is pretty weird, because as far as I could find out, the emperor simply did not have any surviving sons that made it to adulthood, and thus simply no possible heir. As we have already heard in the source by Professor Hurst, quoted earlier, Go-Reizi had no male children. Some sources online even say he had no children at all. So we find it pretty sus Paradox seemingly smuggled in a possible heir here to spice things up even more than they already were in reality. It almost feels like Paradox is playing what if history with us here. But maybe there is a rumour or anecdote about an alleged bastard that we've missed, so please let us know in the comments if you have any idea what the deal is with this kid. We're now left with 3 vassal characters from the scenario. Minamoto Morofusa, the only remaining Rizō character, has a description as follows. Grandson of Emperor Murakami, Morofusa stands as a rare example of an accomplished Minamoto bureaucrat, swiftly climbing the ranks under the wing of his foster father, Kampaku Fujiwara Yorimichi. Though relations between the Fujiwara and Murakami Minamoto remain warm, the other mobile houses and imperial family hoped for Morofusa to stand as a counterweight to Fujiwara influence. So playing as Minamoto Morofusa, you have 2 choices. You can either keep the warm relationship with the regent, your foster father and our big man Yorimichi, or you can side with the imperial family, bringing Chikahito more power and influence. Minamoto Morofusa is a smart chap, with patient, calm, temperate, as well as being a scholar and a poet, and a learning skill of 20. He has 4 wives, no surprises there, and 9 children. The scenario describes how the regent Yorimichi is his foster father, and whilst that isn't actually clear in-game, it turns out that Yorimichi is actually his brother-in-law. But that might not be particularly special, considering how many wives everyone seems to have. Morofusa is also a direct descendant of the imperial family. His grandfather, who is simultaneously his great-grandfather, was Emperor Yamamoto Murakami. The Minamoto were, along with the Fujiwara and the Taira, one of the 4 great clans that dominated politics during the Japanese Heian period. I could not find anything on Minamoto Morofusa in the textbook overviews of the time, like the aforementioned Cambridge History of Japan. However, there is a rather sloppy translation of the Japanese Wikipedia on which he apparently features. There it says that it was already Yorimichi's father, Michinaga, who acknowledged Morofusa's talent, which probably led to the 2 men being close. It also says that Morofusa married Yorimichi's half-sister to be close with the Fujiwara clan. Not far from the capital, we have our first Soryo ruler, Minamoto Yoriyoshi. His introduction says, Yoriyoshi leads the most powerful of Minamoto, those who descended from Emperor Seiwa. Their influence has grown after he and his son, Yoshii, served as generals for the Fujiwara in the Zenkunen War, fighting alongside the Kiyohara family. Their victory has made the Minamoto figureheads of the samurai families of the Bando region, including the powerful Taira. Lots of new info here, so let's briefly cover what this is about. So, in the Zenkunen War, also called the Early 9 Years' War, the imperial court fought the Abe clan in the northeastern Mutsu province, and Yoriyoshi and his family were the main generals winning this campaign for the imperial family and later enforcing the peace. Minamoto Yoriyoshi is 78 years old at the beginning of the scenario, but still a force to be reckoned with. He is brave, arrogant, and impatient, with a martial score of 20. He only has one wife, shockingly, and 6 children, his heir also being a Soryo landowner further north. Yoriyoshi's region of Karachi sits dangerously close to the capital of modern-day Kyoto, meaning that building a solid militaristic house block is essential for survival as a Soryo ruler. Anyway, it is true that after the Zenkunen War, Yoriyoshi's position was significantly strengthened, so I don't think we can interpret his Soryo status as him being a rebellious provincial lord. By 1066, Yoriyoshi was not only old, but also a valued war hero for fighting for the current imperial family, and, perhaps most importantly, had been an ordained monk since 1065. Therefore, I reckon the Soryo status has been earned through his own merit, granting more autonomy from the traditional Rizōryo system. Yoriyoshi's son, Yoshi, who is also in the game, is relevant not only for his popular, not copyrightably showable modern namesake, but also because he is basically the most famous samurai of the 11th century, revered as the ideal warrior by some to this day. His prowess in battle was allegedly so exceptional that he earned the legendary nickname Hachimantaro, meaning son of Hachiman, which is the Shinto god of war. This nickname effectively elevated him from a mere man to a divine figure in the eyes of the warrior class. Another descendant of Yoriyoshi was, as you can see on this historical dynasty tree, Yoritomo, who became Japan's first shogun about a century later. And this is another reason why the game portrays Yoriyoshi as a Soryo ruler, to point you towards the idea of founding the shogunate with this dynasty. Because as a Soryo ruler, you have the unique decision to form a shogunate, a Japanese feudal military government first established in 1192, in which the shogun, a sort of military dictator, holds true power rather than the emperor. You can do this if you manage to become ruling regent of Japan. So whilst this didn't happen for another 126 years in actual history, if you choose this character to start your dynasty, it is not unlikely that you will manage to get there earlier. This decision is also open for our final character, Kiyohara Takanori. In the recent Zenkunen War, Takanori helped the Minamoto wrest control of the north from the long-standing Abe clan. As thanks for this service, the Fujiwara-led imperial court rewarded the Kiyohara with bushi rule of the northern lands. This enviable status, involving little imperial oversight, is tolerated so long as Mutsu's wealth continues to flow south to the capital. Bushi is essentially the Japanese equivalent for knights, and it allows Takanori to operate as a Soryo leader in his own right, as long as he still pays his taxes. Kiyohara Takanori is a brave, ambitious, and arrogant character, who interestingly controls more direct land than anyone else in the starting scenario. Even though the northern lands of Kiyohara Ichizoku are perhaps less developed than their southern counterpart, Takanori's son and heir, Kiyohara Takesada, controls the Ichizoku of Dewa, meaning in just a generation, the Kiyohara dynasty would become a formidable force. Takanori also has only one wife, and 3 other children aside from his heir. Apart from the size of his domain, all of this is pretty spot on. As a reliable source supporting Paradox's background story, I want to quote Japanese historian Takeuchi Rizō's work here on the war and Takanori's efforts to win it for the imperial court. This excerpt also does a great job to give a feeling of the actual feudal reality of the backwaters here, as well as the army sizes we're talking about with big wars in 11th century Japan. It was not until 1062, when Yoriyoshi succeeded in obtaining the help of the Kiyohara, a powerful, partially assimilated Izo family that controlled Dewa, that he was able at last to prevail against the Abe. In the summer of that year, Kiyohara no Takanori arrived in Mutsu with an army of more than 10,000 men, divided into 7 units, each commanded by a family member. By fall, this force and Yoriyoshi's 3,000-man army had taken the last Abe stronghold at Koriyagawa, on the site of the modern city of Morioka in Iwate Prefecture, and killed Sadato, bringing an end to the earlier 9 Years' War. In Crusader Kings, Takanori is also the only character to border an independent character, Kimi Abe Tomitada of the Tsugaru. Whilst it's not possible yet to conquer these lands, if you manage to get the imperial policy changed to imperial pacification, you can bring Japanese dominance to the northern tribes. In conclusion, we think Paradox has done a decent job of portraying the political circumstances of 11th century Japan and simulating the conflict of the old order in the game represented by the Rizō government with the new feudalism emerging in the provinces. Of course, there are some minor and more major inaccuracies, like an heir that shouldn't be there, or a rival that should be more like a marshal or important general, but the detail with which Paradox has engaged with this region to once again strike a balance between fun gameplay and historically informed content is quite nice to observe, and it was fun to be able to dive into historical sources and then find them well reflected in the portrayal of this region. Let us know in the comments if you'd like us to cover more characters and scenarios from the new DLC. And very soon we're going to make some new videos on Europa Universalis 5, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time for more History in Bits.